Hey friends, so today we are going to talk about newcomers. And when I use that phrase, what I'm really talking about are Europeans who came to the Americas starting with Columbus in 1492. We're actually going to go back a little bit before then to talk about the Portuguese, but they are just a more foundational piece. But really, we're going to think about Columbus and the aftermath of Columbus. I wanted to start with this painting. This is actually a painting in the Capitol building, painted in 1875 of Columbus and, quote, the Indian Maiden. For your discussion board, you're going to analyze this painting, so I want you to spend a little bit of time with it and think about it. But for right now, you could even pause the video, but I would encourage you just to jot down some of your first impressions. What do you think about it? What do you notice about it? And then we're going to come back to it at the end. So I want to start with the early explorers here. And I mentioned we're going to start with the Portuguese. Often American history starts with Columbus. I like to start with Native Americans, but I think it's important that we talk a little bit about the Portuguese because although they don't really play a huge role in the peopling of the Americas, with obviously the major exception of Brazil, they're really important in setting the stage for European exploration. The Portuguese came up with the design for the ship that was better equipped and better able to cross the Atlantic Ocean. They did not head west across the Atlantic. They instead used their new ships to go to the east, and they are going to be the ones that first really explore the African coast. They're the ones that are going to begin the African slave trade. So it's the Portuguese that kick off that aspect of American colonialism, and it is the Spanish and then later the French and the English that will develop many of the colonies that then those African people will be forced into through the African slave trade. So the Portuguese are kind of foundational for setting all of that up. But for the larger process of American settlement, Christopher Columbus is obviously really, really important here. Now, many of you have learned about Christopher Columbus. I'm sure you've got some ideas in your head about who this man was. Obviously he sails in 1492. He's sailing on behalf of the Spanish crown. He is searching for a faster route to Asia because he's interested in wealth, right? He wants spices. He wants the things that will enrich himself. When he approaches the king and queen in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, he has been pitching this idea for quite some time to other leaders in Europe, and everyone has said no to him. This is a wild proposition, and not because people thought the earth was flat. That's actually a myth. Most educated people were fully aware that the earth was round. But they didn't know how large the earth was, and they certainly didn't know what was in the Atlantic Ocean. It had not been crossed. And so if you look at maps from this time period, they all have sea monsters in them in the Atlantic. It was a huge unknown and a huge risk. But he happened to hit Ferdinand and Isabella at just the right time. In 1491, they had just finished what was known as the Reconquista. This is the end of about 800-year war between Spain and Islamic invaders who had occupied the Iberian Peninsula. This was seen as this, great triumph of Catholicism over Islam. And so when Columbus comes to Ferdinand and Isabella and says, "Hey, I have this great idea," they are in a really good mood, right? It's like when you decide, oh, I really want this thing, but if I ask my parents for it, they have to be in just the right mood to get them to say yes. That's what happened here. And he asks them at just the right time, and they agree. So Columbus, obviously there's a lot more to the story, but Columbus gets not only permission, but funding from the Catholic crown to go, the Catholic Spanish crown to go lead this expedition across the Atlantic. A couple things to keep in mind about Christopher Columbus. Number one, he never came to what's now North America, right? He lands in the Caribbean, and all his later voyages are all in the Caribbean. So, he's certainly not the first quote unquote, white man to come to North America. The other thing to know about him is, while he was a religious man, he was deeply motivated by greed. And so he is looking for wealth. He's looking for ways to enrich himself and enrich the crown. So when he arrives in the Caribbean in 1492 and interacts with the indigenous people there, he is really looking for ways that he can make money. He does not see the spices that he's looking for. He does not see the immediate signs of wealth that he's hoping for. So he's trying to figure out ways that he can justify this trip to the crown and hopefully get more funding from them to make future trips. And so when you read his diaries, his journals, he's talking about, the things that he sees, and he spends quite a bit of time talking about the indigenous people. And he talks about how strong they are, how finely formed their bodies are, how beautiful the women are, although he says he only saw one. And I'd like to pause on that for just a minute and think about that. In that first journal entry, he says he only sees one woman. And then he says that the indigenous people were so friendly and so happy to see him. I would push our analysis on that a little bit. I don't think that he only saw one woman because there was only one woman, right? If you've got these strangers coming in that you have never seen before, nothing about them is familiar, are you going to send your most vulnerable people to interact with the strangers? No, you're going to protect them and hide them. So I think that Columbus's interpretation of these people as being so thrilled to see him and his men is wrong, and a misunderstanding of what was going on. He's also deeply interested in finding gold. In fact, the people are keenly aware of how obsessed he is with gold. Once he wears out his welcome at the first island, they get him to leave by telling him, "Oh, we don't have any gold, but there's gold on the other island over there. Why don't you go check out that island?" Right? So, they were aware of how they could kind of use his own interests against him. In those same journal entries, he points out that they have no religion, which is absolutely not true. They had a religion, just not Catholicism. And he also says that they would be easily converted and they would make excellent servants. So he's already thinking about how they could profit off the bodies and the labor of enslaved people, of indigenous people. This is going to really set the tone of all other explorers to come, right? They're all going to now have this idea of, how the labor of indigenous people could be exploited. Now that's all bad enough, but I wanted to share with you an excerpt from another journal from a man who was on Columbus's expedition. And remember, he made multiple voyages. There were 3 ships, so there were lots of men involved in these expeditions. And, they took place over a series of months and ultimately years when we count multiple expeditions. So this man, Michel de Queño, he is writing about an encounter he has with an indigenous woman. And I want to warn you, it is uncomfortable. There's some really ugly parts to this, so just prepare yourself. So in this quote, again, this is from Michel de Queño, not from Christopher Columbus directly, but he's on the crew. So he says, "While I was in the boat, I captured a very beautiful Carib woman, whom the Lord Admiral Columbus gave to me, and with whom, having taken her into my cabin, she being naked according to their custom, I conceived desire to take pleasure. I wanted to put my desire into execution, but she did not want it, and so treated me with her nails that I wished I had never begun. I took a rope and thrashed her well, for which she raised such unheard of screams that you would not have believed your ears. Finally, we came to an agreement in such manner that I can tell you that she seemed to have been brought up in a school of harlots." So when we read this and we break it down, it should be really clear that what we're seeing is a sexual assault. De Quino sees this woman, and she's topless because that's how people in the Caribbean dressed at this time. It's hot, no need to wear more clothes. It's not sexualized, it's simply the way that they were, the way that they dressed. But he decides that there is provocation in that because European women are completely covered at all times. And so he decides that, she's been given to me by Columbus, so I can do what I want with her. She makes it clear that she is not interested right when she scratches him. And then he says they are able to come to an agreement after he beats her, right? So we don't know what that agreement looks like. Maybe she submitted just to get it over with, or maybe it was all forcible. We don't know. But that last sentence, I can tell you that she seemed to have been brought up in a school of harlots. He's slut-shaming her. He sexually assaults her and then says, see, I knew she wanted it. So, from the earliest encounters between Europeans and Indigenous women, we can see a number of things. We can see the patriarchy here, the assumption of male superiority, the assumption that men can have what they want. We can see here the assumption of European superiority, right? There's no sense that she is an autonomous being who can make her own decisions because he's a man, and because he's a European man, he can have what he wants. So, and then there's, of course, this element of shame because she is not, quote unquote, pure or virginal. And it's, of course, because he forced this on her, but she bears the blame for that. So, I think this is such an important quote, even though it's painful and difficult to read. And I would, ask you to think about this quote, and think about this question. How does this quote help you to better understand future interactions between Indigenous women and European colonizers? How will other European colonizers think about Indigenous women now once they read this kind of account? There's an assumption that if they, quote unquote, conquer the land, they conquer the women, they control and own all of the people on this land. And so if you think about that quote and now look at this image again, how does it impact the way that you interpret this image? And that's something that I want you to think about as you go into your analysis on the discussion boards. Really have that quote in your mind. Maybe you can write about what you thought about the image first and then how it changed after listening to the quote and reading the quote for yourself. But really, analyze that and think about, again, what the long-term implications are for this. Columbus and his men had a certain set of assumptions about female sexuality. And essentially that was any sexuality by women is sinful. And she is stained by that. And so clearly we see that here. But at the same time, they're entitled to that. So, think about those issues. Think about how those might lay a foundation for interactions to come. I look forward to seeing your thoughts as you dive into the discussion boards, and I will join you on them there. For our next video, we will talk about Spanish and French settlements. We'll talk about the Indigenous folks as well as the European women who are settling. All right, that's it for this one. I'll see you next time.